Hi, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thank you for joining us. U.S. intelligence officials held a classified briefing on Capitol Hill on Thursday over reports that Russia offered bounties to kill American soldiers. President Trump has called those allegations a, quote, hoax. Skyler Henry has the latest.
The Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, and other Trump administration officials briefed top-ranking lawmakers on intelligence that Russia offered bounties to the Taliban to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan. A senior Afghan official confirms to CBS News the Russians did offer bounties and that they, quote, achieved some of their goals and keep trying.
I think it's a hoax by the newspapers and the Democrats.
President Trump has dismissed the intelligence data, and the White House maintains that he was not informed verbally, though the report was contained in a written briefing.
The president should have been briefed. This is of the highest priority.
After being briefed by Trump administration officials, top congressional Democrats said in a statement, any reports of threats against our troops must be pursued relentlessly, with leaders going on to criticize President Trump's handling of the intelligence.
We expect the President of the United States to give them that same force protection, that same priority. And we are disappointed that that has not happened.
The Taliban continues to deny the reports, and Russia is pushing back after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused the country of selling weapons to the Taliban.
The Russians have been selling small arms that put Americans at risk there for 10 years. We've objected to it.
The Kremlin says it has only supplied arms to the legitimate Afghan government. Skyler Henry, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
And Skyler Henry joins me now. I'd also like to bring in Catherine Herridge. Catherine is CBS News' senior investigative correspondent. Skyler, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. In your piece, we heard from Speaker Nancy Pelosi. How have other lawmakers responded to the intelligence briefing?
Well, hey, Lana, good evening to you. We heard from her as well as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. They put out a joint statement earlier today, essentially saying that any reports of threats against our troops should be relentlessly pursued. It also went on to criticize the president's relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, essentially calling him soft as it pertains to the relationship between Trump and Putin. And then it concluded saying that the president should be focused more on the daily briefings and less on tweeting military parades, and also commenting on Confederate statues and monuments across the country. Now, of course, that refers to the debate on whether they should stay up or come down. But also part of this is that Speaker Pelosi, in her weekly address, she brought up the point that perhaps now is the time to bring up sanctions as it pertains to Russia, particularly when it comes to their defense and intelligence sectors, because of their alleged conduct. Obviously, these two sectors are at the forefront with this conversation right now. She did say that this was something that was brought up last year in a piece of bipartisan legislation that was then taken to the White House, but the White House kicked back, saying that they wanted the defense and intelligence portions of this bill removed here. So she said that those should be brought back up. And then she also mentioned this. She said that what the White House is presenting right now in terms of how the president received this intelligence, she calls it a con, and saying that obviously the degree in which there's intelligence, it varies, right, in terms of how accurate it may be. But when she said that it should be at the forefront and should be presented to the president almost immediately when it pertains to the safety of the men and women in uniform, Lana.
All right, so that leads very well into what I want to ask you, Catherine. What are you learning about why President Trump received this information as a written briefing and was not verbally briefed? And what is really the standard kind of briefing in this type of situation?
Well, Lana, a key question this week has been who made the call not to verbally brief the president about this unverified intelligence. Was it someone who was a political appointee, or was it someone who is a career civil servant in the intelligence community? And according to the White House's National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, that decision was made by a career intelligence official, in this case, the CIA briefer, based on what they believe to be the lack of veracity of that intelligence. So that's point number one. Point number two is, how do presidents consume this intelligence that's known as the president's daily brief? There are really two versions of it. One is a written version, and the other is this verbal briefing I've just described. We've seen President Bush, I know from my experience covering that White House, that he was someone who was very engaged with the briefing and the briefer. He would have rapid-fire questions, a little bit like Jeopardy. That's what one briefer said to me. And then he would have follow-on requests that the briefer would take back. President Obama was a different consumer of this intelligence. He liked to have the president's daily brief available to him on an iPad so he could read it himself and go through it at his own pace. And this president consumes that information entirely differently. He likes to have, based on my reporting here at CBS News, an in-person verbal briefing 3 times a week. And the reason all of this matters is that the president's daily brief in its written form can take anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes to read back to front. And that's just not the kind of time that the briefer has with the President of the United States. So they've got to make decisions in real time about what's the priority, what's corroborated, what's verified, and what does he need for the decisions that are right in front of him in terms of national security.
Catherine, I think you've been very helpful in delineating the difference between who was making that call, but why put it into a written briefing with the understanding that that's simply not how President Trump is consuming his information? Or why put it in a written briefing if you feel like the information that you're receiving is not valid? That's part of what I think people are struggling with.
Well, I guess I would break it down a little bit further. You do have information in the president's daily brief which is not 100% verified. That's because really almost no intelligence reaches that threshold. Intelligence officials have different levels of confidence about the information. And what I would call an emerging threat or an emerging national security risk may not be verified to a great degree, but it gets into the PDB because it may be a red flashing light down the road, right? It's kind of like a signal. This may be coming on the horizon. So that's point number one. And then point number two is that the president's daily brief, by its name, I think a lot of people assume only the president sees it, but that's not true. It's probably about a dozen people across the government, very senior, high-level officials, some of them cabinet secretaries, who have a version of that document. So you got a lot of eyes on that document. It's not just the president of the United States. And I think that raises the follow-on question, which is, if it was in front of a lot of people, how come it didn't go sort of to the top of the chain, if you will, if it was that pressing in terms of the intelligence value? And I think the answer to that is that there was dissent within the intelligence community about how valuable it was. And there are other issues that we're facing that are more corroborated or they have more confidence about, and they've got to make decisions on that almost, in the moment.
Skyler, President Trump has said that reported assessments about Russian bounties on U.S. troops are a, quote, hoax. Can you explain the president's reasoning?
Well, the president didn't take questions today during this morning briefing with the press earlier today, but he did have a one-on-one interview yesterday in which he did call these allegations a hoax. But essentially, this stems from what Catherine was saying earlier, and that he felt as though, or that the people in the intelligence community felt as though it didn't rise to the level to be briefed to the president. He also went on to say that if this were the case, he said that he would actually reach out to Russia and have a, quote, conversation with them. They would have essentially heard about it, saying that he did have an issue with it. But again, he is leaning on to the perspective that the intelligence community, they found as though what was being reported as far as these bounties on U.S. troops didn't rise to the level of hitting his desk, so to speak, or it did hit his desk, but not in terms of a verbal briefing there. And so that is where I think that hoax word starts to come around. And of course, this is a similar rhetoric that the president likes to use when speaking about Russian conversations. We saw that with the election interference and the impeachment proceedings earlier this year, where he referred to it as a hoax then. And so I think that's a word that he likes to use in these instances like that. But again, he is siding with the intelligence community here in that this information didn't rise to really concern he or the administration.
So, Catherine, what about that? How is the president's response, that the hoax response, being received by the intelligence community? And I think it'd also be really helpful for our viewers to know, what does the intelligence community think about this information now?
Well, based on my reporting here at CBS News, there is this dissent between the CIA, which gathers intelligence from human sources, for example, interrogations of detainees, and I believe that that was the information that was developed on the ground in Afghanistan by the CIA, and then also the National Security Agency, or NSA, and they handle electronic intelligence, so telephone calls, emails, text messages, electronic surveillance. And when you brought these two streams of information together, they just didn't sync up, basically, is what happened here. The reason all of that matters is that it would be wrong to think that we had to have 100% confidence in this information to do something, because that's not what happened here. What happened here is that we had unverified or uncorroborated information, and we did act on it in some level. There was an increase in force protection to make sure troops in Afghanistan were, I'll put it this way, sort of aware of the threat, so measures to better protect them. And then we shared the information with our allies, so they were aware of this potential threat. And then at the National Security Council, they developed what they call options, which means they've got a game plan if it turns out that the information is verified. So those are the three prongs of what happened here. What didn't happen is that it wasn't briefed in person to the President of the United States. And I know that sounds kind of like a disconnect, but that kind of thing happens a lot because we get so many threat streams targeting the United States that you can't take everything to the president's desk. And we take lots of actions to better protect our forces that don't require getting it to his desk in the Oval Office.
Yeah. So, Catherine, I actually want to ask you about the inverse of this, which is, how might the fact that this intelligence was leaked actually impact the nation's security assessment and action plan?
The leaking of the information, and I'm not against leaking. I'm a journalist. I just want to say that sort of with full disclosure. But in this particular case, the question is whether the leak of the information has now compromised our understanding of the source and our understanding to really run it to ground, to understand whether Russian intelligence paid the Taliban a bounty to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And I think more importantly, who directed that? Was this a rogue operation within Russian intelligence, or was it directed at the highest levels of the Russian government, for example, by President Vladimir Putin? So our ability to track it down, I think, is compromised, because once it's out in the public square, then often these channels of information go dark. I just want to add that I've had conversations this week with military intelligence contacts who have worked actively in the Afghan theater, and I heard from them something which I think could be very important going forward, which is that anytime you're facing threat information about the Russians, you always have to consider whether it's disinformation. You know, their tactic is to get you looking one way while they're developing a plan of attack to come at you sort of from a rear offensive. So you have to always be thinking, is this information about a real threat, or is this information designed to have me looking in the other direction so that I'm vulnerable on this side to attack?
Very interesting information. Skyler Henry, Catherine Herridge, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lana.